Well, hello there, and welcome back to our series of videos on the topic of inheritance. Now, in the last video, we learned about the process of natural selection, and we saw that it is the process where better adapted varieties are selected for, and they're selected so that they can survive more, reproduce more, and pass on more of their genes to the next generation. Now, in this video, we're going to take a look at the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution is a bit different from the process of natural selection. So the theory of evolution is the idea that new species arrive from more ancestral forms. And so here's the idea. Imagine this is an ancestral form. So ancestral means like in the past, like millions of years ago, there was like an ancestor, some sort of ancestor organism called A. So the idea is that A can give rise in the future to new species. So this might have been a common ancestor, and then maybe some of the common ancestors went to one place and then they became apes, and then some of the ancestors went to another place and they evolved to become humans. Something like that. Right? So evolution is this idea that a new species can arise from more ancestral forms, older forms. And people believe there's this theory that evolution occurs through the process of natural selection. So natural selection occurring over many millions and billions of years can result in new species being produced from older ancestral forms. So natural selection is the process, while evolution is kind of like the larger theory. Okay, and this theory was actually first proposed by Charles Darwin, the same guy, when he went on this voyage in the ship, the Beagle. Right, so here's Darwin, here's his ship. And he wrote a book called The Origin of Species. It's a very famous book, where he explores this theory of how new species originate. So how new species can arise from more ancestral forms. So what led to Darwin coming up with this theory of evolution by natural selection? Now, one of the observations that really gave him evidence for this theory was when he looked at finches. Now, finches are a kind of bird, a very tiny bird. And Darwin went around different islands. Okay, the Galapagos Islands are made out of many small islands. So he went to all the different small islands and he saw that on each island there was a different species of finch. And he realized that each species of finch was adapted to a different kind of diet. So their beaks were slightly different shaped and they were adapted to eat different kinds of things. And Darwin's big question was, how did these different species come about? Did they originate or arise from some form of ancestor? So here's a picture showing what Darwin observed. So he went to different islands, right? And he saw that on one of the islands, the finch looked like this. On another island, they looked like this. On the third island, they looked like this. And on some islands, the finches were adapted to eat insects, while on other islands, they were adapted to eat seeds. And so their beaks looked different. And in yet another island, they were adapted to eat fruits and cactus and so on. So his question is, was there some ancestor, right, which gave rise to all of these new species of finch? And if that happened, then how did it happen? So Darwin came up with this explanation, right? Based on his observations, he came up with a theory to explain his observations. That's what scientists do, right? We look at observations and then we come up with a theory to try to explain those observations. So Darwin's explanation was that, okay, there's so many different species of finch. Well, they might have all arose or came from a common ancestor. And then that common ancestor went through the process of natural selection and this thing called adaptive radiation to give rise to all these other new species of finches. So here's this idea again in pictures. He thought that there was an original ancestor, right? So this is an ancestral form. This is the ancestor. And this ancestor migrated to different islands. And through the process of natural selection, became new species of finch. So there was one that migrated to an island with many large seeds. And through the process of natural selection, it became this new species of finch which was good at eating large seeds. And then there's another, some of the ancestors flew to an island where there were lots of cactus, and so those ancestors, through the process of natural selection, became a new species which eat cactus. And then, some of the ancestors went to an island where there were many flying insects. How horrifying, how horrifying. Many flying insects. And so, the ancestors, through the process of natural selection, had slender beaks, which were very good at eating flying insects. And so on, right? So, the idea is that this common ancestor migrated to different islands had different kinds of food, and so natural selection took place, and over time, in each island, a new species was formed through natural selection. So adaptive radiation, right, which is this other process which I mentioned, right, is this idea that a common ancestor can give rise to many different species, where each species is adapted to a particular environmental niche or a role. So in the case of Darwin, this ancestor, the common ancestor finch, evolved into many new species of finch. Each was adapted to a different kind of diet on each of the islands. Alright, so in word form, here it is. The idea is that there's an ancestor, right? So some ancestor finch migrated to different environments. And importantly, there was variation among all these ancestor finches. So there were finches with slightly longer beaks, finches with slightly shorter beaks, finches with slightly rounder beaks, finches with slightly stubbier beaks. So there's variation. And then there's competition, because in each island, let's say you go to an island with many seeds, right? There's competition for the limited number of seeds to eat. So the finches with beaks which are slightly better at eating seeds will survive and reproduce more. So that leads to natural selection. So nature will select those varieties that are better adapted to each environment. So if you're on an island with lots of seeds, nature will select those beaks which are good at eating seeds. If you're on an island with many flying insects, nature will select those beaks which are better adapted to eating flying insects. And so at the end of the day, in each environment, in each different island, right, different varieties became predominant. And when those varieties no longer can breed with one another, then they become separate, different species. So let's look at the finch, right? So the idea is that the ancestral finch migrated to different islands, right? Went to different environments. And then on each island, right, you have this ancestral finch that there's variation, right? Due to mutation, due to new alleles, some finches have longer, some finches have shorter beaks. Finches compete for a limited amount of food on each island. And then finches with beaks that are better adapted to each island's diet were selected for. And so over time, different varieties of finches arise. So on an island with insects, there's the island-eating finch. And then on the island with seeds, there's the seed-eating finch. So different varieties become predominant on each island and eventually become different species altogether. Alright, so in your textbook, there's this very helpful other example. You can read it on page 380. Or you can also find out more online by searching up this term, allopatric speciation, to find out more about how new species can arise through natural selection. Now, there is one important misconception that I need to highlight, and there's some history behind it. So, back in Darwin's time, there was another scientist called Lamarck. And Lamarck had this view, because they were both Darwin and Lamarck were trying to figure out how the giraffe got this long neck. So Lamarck's view is that originally there's some short-necked ancestor. So giraffes used to have short necks. And Lamarck's view is that because the trees are very tall, this short-necked ancestor will stretch its neck. And you'll continue to stretch its neck until the neck becomes very, very long. And over time, due to stretching of the ancestor's neck, right, the neck of the giraffe will become longer. So Lamarck's view was that actually an individual can change its traits over its lifetime and pass on those changed traits to its offspring. So the idea is that a short-necked giraffe can change to become slightly longer over its life and then pass on that slightly longer neck to its offspring. But Darwin's view was different. Darwin didn't believe that a short-necked giraffe could become slightly longer-necked in its lifetime. Instead, Darwin believed that there's variation, right? So there are some giraffes with shorter necks and some with longer necks. and natural selection will favor those with longer necks, so that over time, there are more of these long neck genes we pass on to the next generation, and over time, there's a general increase in the length of the necks of giraffes, so that they are now currently very long. So Darwin's view and Lamarck's view. Right, so Lamarck's view, so this is Lamarck, and his incorrect view was that individual organisms can adapt by changing their traits over their lifetime, right? The idea that giraffes can grow longer necks or moths can change their color over their life. So some students think that, this evolution happens as individuals change their traits over their life. However, this is not true. Instead, natural selection acts on variation. So the idea again is this whole idea of variation in a population, and then individuals which are better adapted will be selected, so that over time, the frequency of that better adapted trait will increase in the population. Alright, so big question. Do humans and chimpanzees share the same common ancestor? So can we apply this idea of evolution by natural selection to humans and chimpanzees? So the idea is that there's some common ancestor of humans and apes, and maybe this common ancestor migrated to two different places, right? And then over time, one of them, through natural selection, one of them became the chimpanzee, while in another case, through natural selection in a different place, one of them became humans as we know them today. Does the theory of evolution by natural selection, can it explain that? So people from who believe that the theory of evolution can explain that, here's their idea of what happened. So there was some common ancestor of chimpanzees. Can you see that here? Right, it's now extinct, you don't see it anymore. And this common ancestor, it went to a different place and then became chimpanzees as we know them today. And then this common ancestor went to another place and became humans as we know them today. So importantly, it's not the idea that, a chimpanzee, over its lifetime, this chimpanzee became a human being over its lifetime. Now, that's not the theory of evolution by natural selection. The theory of evolution by natural selection is that there was some common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees. Now, it's important to state that not everyone agrees with this theory of evolution by natural selection. Some people say it's only a theory, it's not been observed. After all, it's just our best explanation for why human beings look similar to chimpanzees, or why their DNA is kind of similar. But no one has actually seen the common ancestor of a chimpanzee and a human being alive. And no one's actually seen that over many billions of years, millions of years, this common ancestor became a chimpanzee in one place and became a human in another place. No one has seen that. And we only have evidence of evolution producing new species. So for example, ancestral finch becoming a new species of finch. Or we see, for example, bacteria becoming antibiotic resistant. But we have not seen, for ourselves with our own eyes, changes as large as that between different groups of animals. For example, between, your different groups of mammals, even your dogs and your cats, they're quite different. So, people would argue that evolution is not like a complete theory. Okay, but this of course is controversial and different people have different views. So you have to decide for yourself from the evidence. And here's where I'm just going to end off and say that actually science does have some of its own limitations as well. We always say that in science we need to observe, we need to make experimental evidence, and we make conclusions based on that. But in evolution, we can't really do an experiment to demonstrate it all over again. We can't go back all the way in history and see that common ancestor become two different species. So this has some limitations in science, and I think it's something to just acknowledge even as we learn biology together. Alright, in the next lecture, in the next video, I'll talk to you about artificial selection.